class, Professor Cook here. This week we will be discussing parts of chapters 7 and 10 in your textbook and discussing different terms and concepts to help us understand stratification and poverty. Before I get started with lecture, I wanted to just say I understand this topic is difficult, especially right now with everything that is going on in the world as a result of the pandemic. So just hang in there, and I will try to be as on topic and as brief as possible, but there is a lot of material and a lot of content to explain here. So let's jump in. Okay. Before I start this, usually we do a little question and answer session as a class, and we talk about how much do we know? Like, what do we really have a sense of with respect to stratification and poverty? And what's really interesting is like the little mini quiz we started with at the beginning of the semester, what is quote unquote common knowledge and what the actual statistics are not always the same thing. Okay, so I will let you read these. And then on the bottom here, there is a link to a little video called A Nation of Tribes. This is the language of calling something a tribe is problematic because this is not referring to Native American tribes. But that said, so I'm aware of that problematic bit of the language, but this video is about class and how class position is more than wealth. It's a set of values, a set of expectations, etc. And that's important for us to understand as we discuss class, because it is, like I said, not just based on income. So if you're interested, you can watch that video. It is not required. It's, I think, about 10 or 15 minutes long. And it's pretty dated, so it's kind of fun to see the really old chunky cell phone and out of date fashions. But anyway, okay, so true or false, a majority of Americans are middle class? False. What's interesting though is a majority of people will, when they're asked, they will say that they're middle class. But technically speaking, based on income and the other measures of class, we do not have the majority middle class. We have a bigger working class, working poor, and a smaller upper middle class and elite. So the distribution is really spread out. Okay, 2, the most prestigious occupations have the highest incomes. False. So prestige and income don't always go together. Most of us would say, you know, a firefighter, a police officer, maybe a doctor or someone, maybe a teacher. They're very prestigious jobs, but they are not even the highest paid. Even something like president, right? Presidents, I would certainly love to have the president's salary, don't get me wrong, but it's hard to think of a more prestigious job than being the president, and yet on average, the president's salary is much, much lower than CEOs of companies or several other business people. Okay, 4, a majority believes the nation is divided into haves and have-nots. So at the time this was put together, the answer to this was false. There wasn't a lot of class consciousness. I wonder if this has changed in the past few years with, frankly, with some of the discussion around like Bernie Sanders' campaign and some of the more progressive discussion, talking points, and rhetoric of the left in this country. I think that is shifting. 5, immigration helps many native-born Americans move up the economic ladder. True. The reason this is considered true is that often people who don't have as strong of language skills will perform jobs and take jobs at much lower pay than people who do have language skills. So even though some of the rhetoric around immigration is that there's only a limited amount of resources and jobs, the reality is we, meaning we as a country, will not see people with language skills who are native-born Americans take jobs that people who are immigrants will take, like especially agricultural sector jobs. 6, a majority of Americans no longer believe in the American dream. Again, when this little Quizlet was put together, this would have been considered false. But I'm wondering now if this again is shifted, like number 4. If you consider the American dream, buying a home, retiring, right? I don't know that. I think that there's a general sense of frustration about this, and to some extent some hopelessness about economic situations. Okay. 7. Many Americans are poor, but poverty has decreased since the 80s. False. It has actually increased, and it has gone up and down, but as I'm sure you're aware, we're likely to see a spike in it this year as unemployment claims go up sharply. And I had a friend share a graph about unemployment claims online, and I'll see if I can find that and post it in detail because it's frustrating, but it's interesting to compare it with other recessions. 8. The United States has one of the highest economic equality rates in the world. In other words, we are equal to one another. False. And we are going to explore that in a lot of detail in the video assignment this week. Okay, so key topics we'll be discussing in this unit. What is social stratification? How do we assess it? What does social class and poverty look like in the US? And what is social mobility, and how do we as social scientists categorize and understand that? We will not be spending a lot of time on global stratification and inequality in this chapter, mostly because I want us to just kind of focus on the basics to get through the semester when I know we're all, struggling in one way or another with this situation. That said, in the video assignment and questions for in-class homework this week, I'm asking you to compare something called Gini indexes between countries. That should be pretty straightforward, and I'll be posting more about that soon. Okay, just to kind of preface this, this is not an unbiased source, but I thought that the graphic was interesting. If the United States, the continental United States, not counting Puerto Rico, Alaska, and Hawaii, if U.S. land were divided in the same way that wealth in the U.S. were divided, this is what it would look like. In other words, 1% would own all of this land, 9% would own this. So this top part of the United States here would be 10% of our population would own that much land. Another 30% would get the south here. 20% would have Texas, and then 40% would have to share, I don't know if that's Houston, the red dot, basically. So that's extreme inequality class, and we'll talk more about what that means with numbers, and you'll see the video as well. First though, what is stratification? Stratification, all it means is systematic inequalities between groups of people. They can come from intended or unintended social processes. So in the past in this country, and still, but we had legal segregation, right? So that was legalized stratification, intended stratification based on an individual's racial categorization. Now we still have, of course, stratification based on race and ethnicity and gender, but we also have it based on class, and it is no longer quote-unquote legal to stratify people based on race, so that de jure de facto segregation. All I wanted to connect here was a general concept of stratification versus specific kinds that we've been looking at in the second half of the semester, namely race. This chapter deals with class, and then our final chapter will look at stratification in the context of gender identity and sexual orientation. Okay, so we can, not that we can or should, but we can rank people hierarchically in a society who have different access to resources. The resources we're going to be looking at with respect to this stratification in class terms are wealth, power, and prestige. Okay, class systems in countries can be closed or open. I'm going to spend a minute and explain this difference. Okay, so the United States is an open stratification system. Social classes are fluid. It is based on an achieved status. Okay, so a social class here is a category of people who have similar levels of wealth, power, education, and prestige to one another. So you can be born very poor, and you can end up in life achieving a much higher class position and be very wealthy. That's not a typical story of rags to riches in the United States, but it does happen. You can think about some notable examples, like Oprah, right? She was born very poor and is definitely one of the wealthiest people in the country, I believe. Okay, similarly, people can go the other way. They can be born privileged in terms of wealth and class and end up without having much in terms of wealth and class position. Okay. The difference here is closed stratification systems mean that it's more like a caste system or a system of stratification that you cannot change. So you're born into a position and you stay there. Historically, the US had a caste system with slavery where we had stratification based on race, and that was not something you could change through hard work or education or any other means. There are still closed stratification systems that exist in the world, but it's interesting to think about how these have shifted and changed. Okay, so in that case, under a closed stratification system, your class position, your social position, is more of an ascribed status. It's not an achieved status. Remember those differences. Ascribed statuses you cannot change really, and achieved you can. Okay, I'm going to let you read over this a little bit on your own and look at this part of the chapters. It's a little more background or history here, and it's interesting, but it's not as important for me to explain. Okay, I do want to spend a minute talking about the dimensions of stratification. The first one we'll talk about is wealth. Wealth here refers to someone's money and economic assets minus any debts that they have. Okay, so it's not just your income, it's not just your property, it's your income and property minus debt. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully. It's so hard not to have an audience to check in with. Okay, so wealth here is cumulative, it's passed on to the next generation, and it produces income. What I would do in class if we were together is we would look at the role of home ownership and how that plays into asset retention and the accumulation of wealth in this country. And I think you got a sense of that based on your reactions to the video Race, the House We Live In. And that was the point, was to connect how stratification based on race in this country reinforced stratification based on wealth through housing discrimination and other other types of power that were prohibited for African Americans. Okay, so you can imagine here, if you think about if your average upper middle class white family owns a home, and when the parents of that family need to help their child go to college, they can take out a loan against the amount that they own of the house. Sorry, I'm blanking on the word for that. And help their kids go to college, and then those kids can in turn have an easier time getting their degree without a lot of debt, etc. Then they can go purchase a home, right? So it's based on the asset of your house that really gives you a different social position, a different amount of power, right, to accomplish things. As I said earlier, income inequality is increasing in the US, and then I would like you to, you can watch it now or after this mini lecture, look at this video, Wealth Inequality in the US. It's basically an animated infographic with a voiceover that goes through how income inequality is changing in the US, and it's pretty interesting. I am aware that this video is not an unbiased source. I think you can kind of see the way that they're leaning a little bit in the video. That said, the data that they have compiled for that is based on government reports, so it should be pretty accurate. And so watch that video and answer those questions for in-class points this week. Thanks. All right, spoiler alert. If you haven't watched the video yet, watch it. But this is what wealth and income inequality looks like in the United States. And this is probably slightly worse because these are maybe 7 or 8 years old. But you can get a sense here of what I'd like you to be aware of and notice is how much the top 1% controls of income and wealth compared with the bottom 80%. So this is most of us, class, this little tiny slice of the best kind of pie, for sure, key lime pie. But really, 80% of us have to share this little 7% piece of income. And if this really were a pie chart with real pie, we wouldn't even get to taste that key lime pie because there's so many of us who have to share it. We'd have to just lick it or smell it and then pass it on to the next person. Versus this person, the top 1%, gets almost half of an entire blueberry pie, not my favorite flavor, but still good, to themselves, right? So that is inequality. We're not, as social scientists, we're not necessarily making a judgment call about whether this is good or bad. I would argue it's definitely not good because it contributes to social problems, but we're not necessarily making a judgment call. We're just sort of measuring it here. So if we look at wealth, excuse me, we see a slightly better distribution in the US. It's not perfect though, not perfect. It's still extremely unequal. But you can see the 80% figure here. Those of us who are in here, we get a little more key lime pie to sniff and pass on. And probably the biggest reason between these two being slightly different is this is income and this is wealth with assets included. And because so many Americans own homes, that's calculated into an individual's wealth here. So that's likely what's making this slightly less unequal. Okay. Second dimension of stratification to discuss is this concept of prestige. Prestige is not just a Christopher Nolan movie featuring Hugh Jackman. It's an old movie reference. It is respect, recognition, regard. In the United States, it's associated with wealth. It's based on family background, but also, interestingly, for the US, fame, leadership, occupation. So you can think about the prestige of someone who has a high profile in the public. I think it's interesting to consider in this time of pandemic and coronavirus whose prestige is sort of going up and whose is going down. I think we're all giving health workers the prestige and respect that they so rightly deserve right now. And it's really, really challenging. Typically in the US, prestigious occupations require more education. They're usually about mental activities versus physical activities. Usually they pay more, but not always, and are seen as socially important. So we would call these kinds of jobs white-collar jobs typically, although I think it's interesting right now in this time of quote-unquote essential workers, I think you're seeing more recognition for service sector jobs we would consider pink-collar or blue-collar, and they should be paid more as well. Of course, they're not getting the financial compensation people deserve, but I do think the prestige is going up and awareness of how much we depend on grocery store workers and delivery workers, etc. We need to be appreciative of that, of course. Okay, the last thing I want to discuss for today's mini lecture is the third dimension of stratification, that is power. Okay, for sociologists and social scientists, we understand power in several different ways or to mean several different things. I am not trying to trick you. It's slightly complicated, and if we were in class with a whiteboard, I would diagram it all out for you. Maybe I will record that. Anyway, we'll see. But essentially, we don't just mean coercion, right? Like if you had older siblings, like I did, one type of power older siblings would exert over younger siblings was holding you down and taking your fist and making yourself hit yourself in the face. And then they would say, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself. And I'm sorry to laugh. That's what I always think of when I think of coercive power, right? Is that sort of bullying power. We do mean that, but we also mean the ability to take advantage of opportunities, to control events, to maintain influence despite opposition. So you might put it in terms of both hard and soft power. That you might think about sanctions, like in an international context, on different countries, right? That countries impose against one another, and you can think about how there's sort of incentives and deterrents for countries to cooperate with various international treaties. And that's a kind of power for sure, but it's different from threatening to invade a country or bomb them or something like that. Okay, so on an individual level, we can think about whether or not we have the means to take care of something, or whether we want to, if we have an opportunity, can we actually access that? It was kind of interesting to think about that. C. Wright Mills, he was the person that coined the term the sociological imagination, wrote about power in the earlier part of the 20th century. And he said that in his book, he said the power elite, which is a small group of white men who are disproportionately wealthy, actually control most of the decisions in the US. And even though he was writing probably close to 100 years ago, I would ask you to think about whether or not he's still correct about this. Is this still true? Do we disproportionately have a really wealthy group of people, mostly white men, who have the means and the influence to shape legal guidelines and policies in their own interest? So this is a conflict theoretical lens that we're sort of adopting to explore this concept of power here. But I would ask you to think about that a little bit. And then, why do we accept this level of inequality? I think you can consider that, but there's this link here goes to disparities in how long people have to wait to vote. And then that's not even considering like the legal disenfranchisement we we allow, to, I suppose, to exist in this country based on someone's citizenship status or their record as an ex-convict, right? Okay, so I'm going to stop here for now, and we will finish more later. Thanks.